Hi, my name is Christian Straussner. I'm going to talk about Chapter 28, particularly the legacies of imperialism. First, I want to talk about the empire and economy. Primarily, we see that the principal motives of imperialism kind of derives to gain access to natural resources and agricultural products. The reorganization of subject societies to become more efficient suppliers of materials and products, and trade advantages which led colonial powers to encourage subject lands to provide raw material for processing in other industrialized societies around the globe. One of the main focuses we look at it in this section, we see economic changes. Primarily, colonial rule transformed production of crops and commodities. Colonial administrations reoriented the cultivation of cotton to serve the needs of the emerging British textile industry. Administration encouraged cultivators to produce cotton to exports rather than just local consumption. And so we see infrastructure was built mainly by railroads to ship raw cotton from the uh, interior to the coast. Raw cotton was shipped to England, where factories from there transformed the raw cotton into materials and those high quality textiles. The value of raw cotton exports from India to England grew immensely within this time period to early 1920s. And in addition, the value of the amount of imported finished textiles from England to India also grew exponentially, was showing how trade can benefit from both parties. Next, we kind of want to look at social changes. We see that colonial rule changed the physical landscape and social order. In doing so, vegetation that was in previous form was routinely removed to make way for new crops. Such as rainforests were downed and removed to make way for those crops, and so a lot of the people that were affected, so a lot of the women were recruited in mass to harvest the tea leaves in certain areas. The increase of certain crops like tea made it more available to a wider population in Europe. So not only was tea a societal driving force of the colonial period, but another raw material such as rubber also had a transformative effect on the countries that were able to provide it into the European continent in much as the same way as tea between India and Europe. Um, Next, we kind of want to talk about labor migrations, a very important factor. We see that labor migration was considered to be efforts generated towards the exploitation of natural resources, such as we previously talked about, and agricultural products and subject lands. We see that led to encourage both imperial and colonial powers within the migration for workers within the 18th and 19th century. Two of these major patterns that we see of labor migration is European migrants and indentured labor migrants. Um, I will kind of touch upon both European migrants and indentured migrants in the next two slides, but primarily we both see that both groups profoundly influence the development of societies in both the Americas and Pacific Basin. So first, like I was previously talking about, we have European migrations. Um, going from 1800 1914, we see that well over 50 million European migrants abandoned their homes in order to seek new opportunities in the Atlantic. Most of these migrants originated from relatively poor populations from southern and eastern Europe, areas such as Russia, Italy, and Poland. Some less, not really poor areas, we see Britain, Ireland, Germany, Scandinavia, and then well over 50% of that 50 million is the 32 million migrants who are located in the United States. A considerable portion of these early arrivals explored the cheap lands for cultivation for such products. A lot of these people also heavily settled in the Northeast and provided labor that drove U.S. Industrialization into the 1860s. Uh, Countries such as Canada, Argentina, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa drew a large number of European migrants who became free cultivators, herders, and skilled laborers in mines or fledgling industries within these countries. And some even you know, traveled as free agents, but both uh, others went into indentured laborers. But both groups overall were looking to seek opportunities in temperate regions due to the European and Euro American imperialism in the Americas and South Africa and oceanic regions. Next, we kind of had the indentured labor migrations. As I talked about before, uh, these areas were mainly focused in Asia, Africa, and the Pacific Island nations and became indentured servants who were referred to as slaves. Now, many of us know what these people did during this time period. It's a very touchy subject. Slave trade was slowly diminished. Obviously, indentured laborers took place, uh, often working, transporting the countries in exchange for minimal wages. They lurked, for several years. And most indentured laborers from India came from other relatively poor countries such as China, Japan, Africa, and Pacific Islands, and uh, worked on plantations for those products such as tea, rubber, sugar, as well as other major industries like the railroads in the United States, for gold mines, even specifically in South Africa. And such people also came from a number of different poor countries in the hope of earning such a of earning a living and helping richer countries increase their industries and selective commodities to help their given markets. And for empire migration, we see a large scale of migrations in the 1800s were a result of the influence and economic strength of the imperial and colonial powers. The European and American migrations occurred to more temperate locations, such as I talked about before, where early settlers had already been relocated. Um, Indentured laborers also immigrated to and sent to locations where colonial powers had already created plantations for them to work on. This mass migration, as we talked about before, a large number of workers substantially transformed the societies where they went because they took their culture and ethnic tendencies to new lands. Now, taking that to new lands, we want to talk about colonial conflicts. So, a lot of these policies adopted in imperial powers and colonial officials forced such individuals into various societal backgrounds to deal with one another in a systematic basis. So, a lot of these interactions turned to violent tendencies between colonizers and subjected people, and a lot of these conflicts turned to rebellions. So, two more prominent rebellions that resisted between British and German colonial authority in India was the Sepoy and Maji rebellion. This rebellions often drew from strength from traditional religious beliefs and were led by priests and prophets. Rebellions also served as a major constant threat to colonial rule, as it was a recurring problem. Colonial policies also led to conflicts among people who were brought together artificially into multicultural societies. A lot of these times, people drew on the similarities of linguistic, cultural, and religious differences, um, you know, provided a foundation for more strong ethnic identities and to find themselves in a given culture. Um, Now, more so dodging a very hard topic is the scientific racism. Now, we see that scientific racism is the social and cultural differences were considered to be the foundation and academic pursuit during the 1840s. One of these leading founders is Count Joseph Arthur D. Gobineau from 1816 to 1882, who saw race as the most important index of the human potential. Um, and now in the 19th century, theorists assumed that the human species consisted of several different racial groups, um, which is obviously not a major factor. But he also wrote an essay titled "An Inequality of Human Races," which divided humanity into four main racial groups, each of which was its own particular trait. Kind of a touchy subject. I will leave that to the side. But in 19th and 20th century, racist thinkers based their racial groups off of skin color, biological features such as bone structure, nose shape, cranial capacity, and so on. Taking that biological factor, we move it towards Charles Darwin, moved those factors, who was an English biologist, who argued that all living species had developed over thousands of years in context of survival. Those who adapted and survived would then flourish in their environment. And those individuals took that context and would then develop them in their theories and explain the development and structure of human societies. One person that took that even further is Herbert Spencer, an English philosopher who relied on the theories of evolution of Charles Darwin to explain the significant difference between the strong and the weak. Successful individuals and the races can compete better in the natural world and consequently evolve to higher states, and others seeking as such less fit people. And then we take those factors and we move it towards popular racism. So representatives of both imperial and colonial powers adopted racist views on the basis of personal experience. We see that British colonial Francis' young husband reflected on his experiences in China, Central Asia, and India, making statements regarding race, intelligence, and superiority, then tried to correlate such subjects on a biological standard between the multitude of races, which didn't really make that sense. We look at now with science, It's different, but it doesn't even correlate on a biological standard. And then it's put towards more of a historical context with U.S. and Japanese empires building a developed sense of superiority over the peoples of the conquered world, conquered and ruled, specifically the U.S. forces in the Philippines who tortured a lot of Filipinos on the basis of trying to civilize and Christianize those individuals. Lastly, we want to talk about the nationalism and anti-colonial movements. We kind of see that colonial rules provoked multitude of subjects, people to develop the sense of their own identities. Imperial expansions dominated soon the creation of national identities and the organization of anti-colonial movements in foreign subject lands. And the potential of imperial and colonialism to push subject people towards a nationalism uh, was most evident in India. So for India, we kind of see one of these prominent subjects is Ram Mohan Roy, a prominent Bengali intellectual called the father of modern India, was part of this educated Indian elite who helped forge a sense of Indian identity. He argued that the construction of society based on on the modern European science of Indian tradition was a devotional Hinduism. Supported the British colonial policies and the campaign. Did a lot of forward work, kind of progressing his ideas into much stuff as Christian social reformers to improve the status of women by providing the education and property rights. And kind of going back, he obviously, saw himself as a Hindu guide, went on those Hindu spiritual beliefs to bear the problems and conditions of his own time. And then he took his works and published it into newspapers and found societies to mobilize such facts into educated Hindus and advance the cause of social reforms in colonial India. And then after so, mid-century reformers increasingly called for self-government and at least greater Indian participation in government. Lastly, we see also the Indian National Congress, founded in 1885. It served as a reform for educated to communicate their views on public affairs and officials. Um, Now, a lot of the subjects we see that was discussed within the government was transfer of wealth from India to Britain, trade of terrorist policies, the inability of colonial officials provide, stricken by drought and famine, and British racism toward Indians. Timeline factor, as you can see, in 1909, colonial authorities granted a limited franchise that allowed wealth Indians to elect representatives to local legislative. In 1916, Congress joined forces with the All India Muslim League, the most prominent organization working to advance the political and social interests of Muslims, who made up a roughly 25% of the Indian population. And then in 12th century, Indian nationalism was a powerful movement that would bring independence from colonial rule in the 1947. It's kind of a timeline, get a basis of the idea, but how it all encompasses what the National Congress brought together and how it transformed. Here's a piece of paper that I found interesting, but I hope you enjoyed my presentation, and thank you.